The wind whispered through the dense pines as the last sliver of sunlight faded into the horizon. A tiny cabin, weathered by years of storms and solitude, sat quietly at the edge of an expansive forest. Inside, an older man, his face etched with the lines of time and loss, sat in a creaking wooden chair by the glow of a single lantern. His name was Samuel, a retired schoolteacher who had chosen the serenity of the woods to escape the noise of the world. Life out here was simple, predictable, and uneventful, until it wasn't. 3 nights ago, Samuel had been startled awake by a sound so unnatural, it seemed to ripple through the very air. It wasn't the rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, or even the howl of a distant wolf. It was deeper, stranger, like the groan of metal under immense strain, followed by a tearing sound that made his chest tighten with unease. The sound came from the forest, a place Samuel knew well enough to respect and fear. But this noise wasn't part of the forest he had come to understand over decades. This was something else. That first night he dismissed it. Perhaps it was a tree splitting under its own weight or the echo of a distant landslide. But when the same sound returned the next night, louder and more rhythmic, his curiosity outweighed his caution. Stepping onto his porch, Samuel strained his eyes toward the inky black tree-line. He could see nothing, but the sound persisted. Low thuds, something like tearing, and the faintest metallic pluck that lingered in the air. It made his skin crawl. By the 3rd night, Samuel could no longer ignore it. The sound was louder, and this time he noticed something else. Movement. The trees, tall and unyielding in the windless night, seemed to sway in perfect rhythm with the eerie sounds. It wasn't all the trees, just a patch near the hill that rose in the distance. Samuel rubbed his eyes, doubting what he was seeing. There was no breeze, yet these massive trunks swayed unnaturally, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. The next morning, Samuel ventured closer to the woods with his cane in hand. He didn't have the strength or stamina to go far, but he needed to see if there were any signs of what was causing the disturbances. That's when he found it, a trail of broken branches and flattened grass leading deep into the forest. At its edge lay a deer, lifeless and torn in a way that defied explanation. There were no claw marks, no signs of a predator, just a single clean wound that split the animal in two. Samuel stepped back, his heart pounding. Whatever had done this wasn't natural, and it was moving closer to his home each night. That evening, as he sat by the lantern's light, his hands trembled. He could hear it again, faint but undeniable, the sound of something moving, tearing, and building its presence in the dark. The night pressed on, heavy and still, as Samuel sat frozen in his chair, every muscle in his body tense. The strange noises continued, growing louder and more deliberate, almost as if they were aimed directly at him. The thuds and tearing sounds echoed through the valley, followed by faint random tapping that sent chills down his spine. He leaned forward, peering out the small window above the kitchen sink, but all he could see was the dark outline of the forest. The trees stood motionless now, but he could still hear that unearthly rhythm, closer than ever. Samuel wasn't a man prone to wild imagination. In his decades as a teacher and later as a quiet observer of the natural world, he had seen his share of strange things. A summer storm rolling in too fast, animals behaving in ways that defied instinct, but nothing like this. His rational mind fought to explain what he was experiencing, but no explanation came. The forest, his sanctuary, was turning into something alien, something dangerous. The sounds carried on into the early hours of the morning, and Samuel could feel them more than hear them now. Low vibrations seemed to shake the floor beneath his feet, rattling the glass on the shelves. For a moment, he thought he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the forest, a shadow, quick and fluid, disappearing behind the trees. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to dismiss it as a trick of the lantern light, but deep down he knew better. The next morning the woods felt different. The air was heavier, the usual birdsong absent. Even the chickens, which Samuel dutifully fed each morning, were quieter than normal, huddled nervously in their coop. It was as if the entire valley was holding its breath, waiting. Samuel moved slowly through his morning routine, his joints aching more than usual. He thought about the deer, the strange wound, and the path of destruction leading into the forest. Whatever had done that was still out there, and it was watching. By mid-afternoon, Samuel decided to walk the edge of the forest again, his cane sinking into the soft earth with each step. He couldn't go far, but he needed to know if there were more signs, something that might offer a clue. As he reached the spot where the deer had lain, he saw something new, a series of deep impressions in the ground, spaced unevenly. They looked like footprints, but not quite. The shapes were strange, elongated, and deeply pressed into the soil, as if made by something impossibly heavy. They led straight into the dark woods. Samuel stood there, staring at the trail, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left those prints wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It had a purpose, and that purpose was bringing it closer to him. The sounds, the swaying trees, the crushed earth, it all felt deliberate, like a message he couldn't quite decipher. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Samuel turned back toward his cabin, his unease growing with each step. He thought about his neighbors up the hill, wondering if they had heard or seen anything. Maybe it was time to pay them a visit, though they weren't the friendliest sort. But deep down, he wasn't sure he'd find any comfort there. Whatever was happening in these woods felt like it belonged to him now, as though the forest had chosen him to bear witness to something it had kept hidden for centuries. He didn't know if he'd survive it, but he couldn't deny that he was drawn to the mystery, even as fear gripped his every thought. The day passed slowly, each minute dragging on as Samuel sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the forest line. The impressions in the soil haunted him, their strange shape replaying over and over in his mind. He thought about what could have made them, some kind of animal he'd never seen before, but they were too deliberate, too unnatural. The forest that had once felt like a safe haven now loomed like a living, breathing thing, its shadows deeper, its silence louder. As dusk settled over the valley, Samuel decided he couldn't sit idly any longer. He grabbed the old flashlight from the kitchen drawer, testing it once, then twice to make sure it worked. The beam flickered weakly, but it would have to do. He wasn't planning to go far, just to the edge of the forest, enough to see if the strange tracks had grown or changed. Something deep inside him whispered that they had. The air felt colder as he approached the woods, a biting chill that didn't match the mild weather of the day. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves, though there was no wind to move them. His flashlight beam swept across the ground, finding nothing but the usual brush and dirt until, there it was again, the impressions. But they weren't alone now. Smaller marks, almost like clawed scratches, crisscrossed around them, creating a chaotic path that seemed to stretch deeper into the woods. Samuel's breath hitched. He couldn't tell if the new marks were from the same creature or something else entirely. The air grew heavy with a strange metallic scent, sharp and unnatural. Samuel pulled his jacket tighter around him, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt. The forest no longer seemed indifferent. It felt like it was watching him. He turned back toward the cabin, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Each step felt heavier, his knees protesting, but his heart pushed him forward. He didn't dare look back, though he swore he could feel something moving just beyond the edges of the light. Back inside, he bolted the door, his hands shaking. He tried to focus on mundane tasks, boiling water for tea, feeding the chickens, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought again of his neighbors. If anyone might have seen or heard something, it was them. But as much as he wanted to drive up the hill and knock on their door, something held him back. They were private people, reclusive even, and Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening out here, they might already know about it. The night dragged on, the same unsettling sounds returning just after midnight. Thuds, tearing, tapping, closer now. Samuel sat by the window, staring out into the blackness. This time there was no mistaking the movement. The trees swayed again, but it wasn't just the trunks. It was something between them, something massive and fluid, almost blending into the shadows. His flashlight was on the table beside him, but he couldn't bring himself to reach for it. What good would light do against something he couldn't understand? As the hours passed, the noises seemed to circle the cabin, rhythmic and deliberate. Samuel's chest tightened. Whatever it wasn't just wandering through the valley. It was seeking something. And Samuel feared he already knew what. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in around Samuel. Every sound, every creak of the old wooden floorboards, made his heart race. Outside, the night was alive with a strange rhythm of thuds and tearing, the tapping growing louder and more erratic. He sat in the dark, the flashlight still untouched on the table beside him. His breath shallow and uneven. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was staying, circling, waiting. Samuel's mind raced, replaying the sounds, the footprints, the mangled deer, and the swaying trees. None of it made sense, and the more he tried to piece it together, the more his thoughts spiraled into fear. The metallic scent he'd noticed earlier was back, faint but undeniable, seeping through the cracks of the cabin. It wasn't just outside anymore, it was here, surrounding him. He pushed himself out of the chair, his joints protesting as he moved to lock the windows. As he reached the last one, his hand froze. Just beyond the glass, in the faint light of the moon, he saw movement. Not the trees this time, but something else. Low, shadowy, and massive, shifting between the trunks. His breath caught in his throat. It was real. Whatever it wasn't natural, and it wasn't afraid of being seen. Samuel backed away from the window, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. The old shotgun in the corner of the room caught his eye, and though he hadn't fired it in years, he found himself reaching for it. His hands trembled as he loaded the shells, the sound of metal against metal echoing in the silent cabin. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but holding it made him feel slightly less powerless. The noises outside grew louder, the tapping now joined by a low, guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't random anymore. It had a pattern, deliberate and unsettling. Samuel stood in the center of the room, gripping the shotgun tightly, his eyes darting to every shadow that flickered across the walls. He felt like prey, cornered and helpless. Then it happened. A crash, deafening and violent, shook the entire cabin. The sound came from the back wall, where the wood splintered and groaned as if something enormous had pressed against it. Samuel stumbled backward, the shotgun shaking in his hands. He could hear it now. Deep, labored breathing, low and resonant, just beyond the shattered wall. His chest tightened, the air in the room feeling impossibly thin. The lantern flickered, casting wild shadows that seemed to move on their own. He pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam flickered weakly, illuminating nothing but jagged wood and darkness beyond. The breathing grew louder, and Samuel could swear he saw something, massive, shifting, and impossible to define, just outside the breach. He froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The air grew colder, the metallic scent now overwhelming. He felt the presence of something vast and ancient, something that didn't belong to this world. And then, as the room seemed to collapse around him, the sounds stopped. Silence fell like a heavy weight, but it wasn't a relief. It was worse. Whatever was out there wasn't gone, it was waiting. Samuel stood frozen in the suffocating silence, his ears straining for even the faintest sound. The metallic scent lingered, thick and sharp, making his stomach churn. His grip on the shotgun was so tight his knuckles turned white, but the weapon felt useless in his trembling hands. He didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest shift would break the fragile stillness and summon whatever was lurking just beyond the broken wall. Then the sound returned, not from outside but from within. A low, almost imperceptible tapping echoed from somewhere deeper inside the cabin, faint yet deliberate. Samuel's heart slammed against his ribcage as he slowly turned his head, the realization dawning that he was no longer alone. The tapping grew louder, moving through the walls, up the beams, and across the floorboards, as if the very structure of the house had come alive. His breath caught as he saw it, a shadow flickering across the far wall, impossibly large and shifting like liquid smoke. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't just a trick of the light either. It moved with purpose, gliding from corner to corner, growing darker and more defined with each passing second. Samuel backed away, his heels scraping against the uneven floor, and raised the shotgun. The shadow didn't stop. It seemed to ripple, bending and stretching, filling the room with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. As he stood there, his pulse roaring in his ears, Samuel realized something horrifying. The shadow wasn't alone. More shapes began to emerge, smaller but just as unnatural, slithering out from the broken wall, crawling along the edges of the room like they were testing their new surroundings. Their movements were erratic, jerking and twisting in ways that defied logic. Samuel aimed the shotgun, his finger hovering over the trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. What was he even aiming at? The creatures, or whatever they were, had no clear form, no solid mass. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on life. The tapping grew louder, faster, almost frantic, until it merged with a faint tearing sound he had come to dread. But this time it wasn't outside. It was everywhere, above him, below him, surrounding him. He felt the vibrations through the floor, the walls, even in his chest. It was like the house itself was being pulled apart piece by piece, and Samuel was trapped in the center of it all. Then, without warning, the lantern's flame flared violently and extinguished, plunging the room into complete darkness. Samuel's flashlight flickered again, but the weak beam barely pierced the black void. His breathing came in shallow gasps as he heard something new, whispers. Faint, indistinct voices that seemed to come from every direction at once. They weren't human, but they carried an eerie cadence, like a language he couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Samuel stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the table, sending him sprawling to the floor. The shotgun clattered out of reach as he scrambled to push himself up. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that drilled into his skull. And then, just as he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, they stopped. All at once, everything went silent. He lay there, trembling, his hands pressed against the cold floor. The silence was deafening, but it was short-lived. A low rumble began to build, distant at first, then closer, like something massive moving through the earth. The cabin shook, the wooden beams groaning under the strain, and Samuel realized with a sickening certainty that whatever had been outside wasn't waiting anymore. It was coming for him. The ground beneath Samuel's cabin trembled as the rumble grew louder, deeper, vibrating through his chest. He clawed his way toward the shotgun, his hands shaking, his mind racing. The shadows in the room seemed to swell, pressing in closer, consuming what little light remained. The whispers, silent for only a moment, returned with a vengeance. Louder now, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that felt as though it was tearing into his very thoughts. Samuel gritted his teeth, grabbed the shotgun, and turned toward the broken wall, determined to face whatever was coming. The rumble stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural stillness in its wake. Samuel held his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger, as the cabin creaked and groaned around him. Then, from the gaping hole in the wall, something began to emerge. A shape, massive and shifting, its edges flickering like heat waves on a scorching day. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't entirely incorporeal either. It moved with a deliberate grace, its form constantly twisting, as if it couldn't quite settle on what it wanted to be. Samuel raised the shotgun, aiming at the heart of the shifting figure. His hands trembled, sweat dripping into his eyes, but he didn't pull the trigger. The thing stopped just inside the wall, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, to Samuel's horror, it spoke, not with words but directly into his mind. The whispers sharpened, coalescing into a single chilling thought. "You have been chosen." Samuel staggered back, the shotgun slipping from his grip. His knees buckled and he fell to the floor, his heart pounding like a drum. The thing advanced, its form shifting and stretching, and as it loomed over him, he could see something within it, a swirling, chaotic void filled with countless glimmering lights. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once, and Samuel couldn't look away. The lights seemed to pulse, growing brighter, and he realized with sickening clarity that they weren't lights at all. They were eyes. Thousands of them, staring directly at him. Just as he felt the darkness closing in, the cabin shuddered violently, and a blinding light erupted from the forest beyond. The figure recoiled, its form shrinking back toward the hole in the wall as the light intensified, spilling into the room like a flood. Samuel shielded his eyes, his breath hitching as the light grew brighter and brighter, until the shadows were completely consumed. The whispers turned to shrieks, high-pitched and piercing, before fading into silence. When the light finally dimmed, Samuel lowered his hand, blinking against the afterimage burned into his vision. The cabin was still. The shadows were gone. The broken wall remained, but beyond it, the forest was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Samuel pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaky but steady enough to stand. He stepped cautiously toward the breach, his heart hammering in his chest. As he peered out into the forest, he saw something he couldn't explain. The swaying trees were gone, replaced by a perfect circle of scorched earth. At its center lay a small object, barely visible in the moonlight. Samuel stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but he couldn't stop himself. The object glinted faintly, a shard of something metallic, smooth and cold to the touch. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, and as he held it, he felt a strange calm wash over him. The whispers were gone, the shadows defeated, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The shard was a part of something larger, something ancient and powerful, and it had chosen him. Samuel stood there, the shard in his hand, staring into the quiet forest. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. Samuel stood in the clearing for what felt like hours, the metallic shard cool in his hand, its faint pulse a reminder of everything that had just transpired. The forest was still, unnervingly quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He turned the shard over again, trying to make sense of its smooth surface, its strange weight that didn't feel entirely physical. It glowed faintly in the moonlight, almost alive, and he felt a strange pull, as though it wanted him to keep it close. The calm of the moment began to seep into his bones, his heart slowing after its relentless pounding. He looked around the clearing, his eyes tracing the scorched earth, the stark contrast against the dark forest beyond. Whatever had happened here, whatever force had intervened, it was gone now. But the shard in his hand told him that it wasn't over. Not entirely. This was a piece of something much larger, something he couldn't yet understand. Slowly, he made his way back to the cabin, his legs heavy, his body aching from the tension and fear of the night. The broken wall gaped open, letting the moonlight flood inside, but the cabin felt oddly safe now, as if the darkness that had haunted it had truly been driven away. He placed the shard carefully on the table, its faint glow lighting up the room in a way that felt comforting rather than eerie. For the first time in days, Samuel exhaled deeply, the weight of his fear lifting just enough for him to feel human again. As dawn broke, painting the valley in soft hues of orange and pink, Samuel sat on the porch with a cup of tea in his hands. The forest seemed almost peaceful, the chaos of the past nights feeling like a distant memory. But he knew better. The shard was still inside, resting quietly on the table, and he could feel its presence even from out here. It wasn't just an object. It was a message, a reminder that whatever had come for him wasn't entirely gone. It had left something behind, perhaps as a warning or an invitation. Samuel thought about his neighbors, wondering if they'd seen or heard anything. Maybe he'd make that trip up the hill after all, just to talk, to find out if they'd noticed the strange lights or the sounds that had filled the valley. He wasn't sure what he'd say or how much he'd share. Part of him felt like this was his burden to carry, a secret he wasn't meant to tell. But another part of him, the part still curious after all these years, wondered if he'd find answers by reaching out. As the sun climbed higher, casting away the last traces of shadow, Samuel felt a quiet resolve settle over him. Life out here had always been simple, predictable. But now something had changed. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was part of something much bigger, something ancient, something alive. And he was tied to it now, in ways he couldn't yet explain. For now he'd wait. He'd keep the shard safe and watch the forest. His quiet life forever altered by a single unexplainable night. Whatever came next, Samuel knew he wouldn't face it with fear. He'd faced the unknown and survived, and now he was ready for whatever might come.